Just a brief, I don't speak that long. It's just a brief commercial of who we are. It's a North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. We're located in New Jersey. Although now that we're on Zoom, we have members from over 11 states. And you saw Barry Crompton from is also a member from Australia. So it's changed the
Oh,
dynamic. It changed. Everybody else, you got to turn your sound off, okay? Um, so it sort of changed the dynamics of it. Our programs, I just wanted to point out the thing, especially Jim Chris. What we do, if you heard John Sarnes speak, we offer 15 minutes to any roundtable historical society. Just get a hold of me. You got strict 10 minutes to tell us all about your organization. And it's just a way of getting everybody to know each other. It's no longer a live meeting where you get to meet the people. So that's what it is. Our programs are also offered, and this is something you guys might have considered in order to get more people involved. As a public service, we offer the link to public libraries. And for the authors involved here, your program now appears on the calendar of quite a number of public libraries here, although it could be anywhere because we supply the link. So the name of the whole program, the same flyer that you guys got, is on the calendar of various libraries, including obviously the bio of the author, which can't, let's face it, with the books they have to buy, they'll listen, and we found out that a number of them have listened to the talk and then have purchased the book. So that's where we're coming from. We are a member of we're a color bearer level of now it's Battlefield Trust. Used to be Civil War Trust. Now it's American Battlefield Trust. And you heard us mentioned before, we're the only group that has a members-only book group. And again, it's something to offer your membership. Not everybody participates in this. And the way we handle it, it's not the book of the month. We do a book, go into discussion, we stop where we are, continue on for the next month. And as long as our discussion
63.
continues, it continues. That's where we are. I'm sorry, running late. Normally, I try to introduce as many people as possible, but now we got somebody from Steve Dashniak, his American Revolution, got him to come into the program. Welcome. I'm just looking at names that appear through here. Okay, now we will start the program. This is it's the third time, yeah. Jeff Hunt, he's the director for the Texas Military Forces Museum. I turned the light off at the back of me, a Camp Mabray in Austin, Texas, which is the official museum of the Texas National Guard, and an adjunct professor of history at Austin Community College, where he's taught since 1988. He holds a bachelor's degree and a master's in history, both from University of Texas at Austin. He's a recipient of the Chicago Civil War Roundtable Edwin Cole Barrs Award, Outstanding Scholarship, 22. He's a prolific author, and he's the author of Meade and Lee After Gettysburg. And that's what we've been doing now. We're running a whole sequence, a series of the program of going battle by battle by battle, as long as Meade has been with on these campaign. Gettysburg, the forgotten stage of the Gettysburg campaign from falling waters to Culpeper Courthouse, and by Sabbath Beatty. Jeff, I know you give one of the things that Jeff gives a detailed talk. We got people of limited. They last an hour, and afterwards they drop off. What I'm telling you point blank, if you see yourself, don't speed up at the end. We'll continue next month. Jeff is coming back next month. And I'm dead serious about this. Bob Wong mentioned the fact that you also give a talk about the last battle in New Mexico. So if you want to be a continuing speaker on us, we'd love to have you back again.
It's good to see you. I'm happy to come back to talk about the second half of my second book, Meade and Lee at Bristoe Station. This is the biggest of the three books in the series thus far. It covers August, September, and October of 1863. And the last time I was with y'all, we dealt with the August-September portion of the book. And today we're going to talk about the meat of the book, which is the Bristoe Station campaign. It'll be followed by a talk I'm going to give next month on the Battle of Rappahannock Station. And the fourth book in the series I'm still working on, but have promised Ted Savas I will have it to him by the end of this spring, is Meade and Lee at Mine Run. This, of course, period that follows the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia from Lee's retreat over the Potomac River after Gettysburg through the end of 1863, is a period of the war that has generally been overlooked by historians because it didn't produce any great big battle on the order of Fredericksburg or Chancellorsville or Second Manassas or something like that. History sort of skips over it, fast forwards till it can get to the Battle of the Wilderness and the start of the Overland campaign. But you can't really understand where the war goes in 1864 without this 6 months when Meade is in charge of the Army of the Potomac without Grant looking over his shoulders. This is the bridge between the Gettysburg campaign and the Wilderness campaign. And it is a very, very active period. A great deal goes on. There is a lot of maneuvering. There is a lot of fighting. And of course, always the potential that the battles that do happen could escalate into a major engagement. The fact that they didn't speaks to the generalship of Meade and Lee at various times, declining battle, and at other times seeking battle. But you can't understand how you can have a wilderness campaign if you don't get this middle period of the war. And that's what this series of books is about. So this evening, we want to talk about the Bristoe campaign, and just a little bit of background here. So after the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee slips into the Shenandoah Valley. Meade reluctantly follows him across the river by slipping into the Loudoun Valley. For about 10 days, there's a sort of game of blind man's bluff between the two armies, with the Blue Ridge Mountains and a flooded Shenandoah River separating them. Meade does not always get well served by his intelligence arm, and Lee is able to slip through the mountains and resume his position in central Virginia, once again putting his army between the Federals and the Confederate capital of Richmond. So at the end of July of 1863, this is where the armies are. The Confederates are below the upper Rappahannock River, which you see right here in Culpeper County. The Federals have based themselves around Warrenton, and this is the point where the Gettysburg campaign truly comes to an end. On August 1st of 1863, federal forces will grab bridgeheads at Rappahannock Station and Kelly's Ford, and this is an anticipation of Meade trying to drive Lee farther back by advancing down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Just as Meade was about to undertake that operation, President Lincoln and Major General Henry Halleck tell him to stop. And the reason that Meade is told to halt his army on the upper Rappahannock is that he's going to have to detach a good portion of it to go and enforce the draft in the north. They're also going to send some troops down to reinforce the siege of Charleston. Halleck tells Meade that they have no reinforcements to give him in case he gets into a great big battle. And of course, if he continues to push down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, he's apt to get into a great big battle. Meade therefore pulls his army up on the upper Rappahannock, and although nobody at the time knew it, for the next 6 weeks, the two armies are going to be relatively static, not entirely static, but relatively so. And during this period, we have a big strategic debate among the Union High Command, and Lincoln and Halleck and Meade. And that debate really centers around what the Army of the Potomac should be doing next. Obviously, it needs to lick its wounds, just like the Army of Northern Virginia needs to lick its wounds after the Battle of Gettysburg. Both armies are going to recover from that campaign relatively quickly, so that by the time you get to the beginning of September of 1863, Lee's army is at a strength of 72,000 men. It's just a few thousand men off what it was at the start of the Gettysburg battle. And Meade's army has recovered to 88,000 men, so basically the strength that it had on July 1st of 1863. So the idea that both armies are crippled for 6 months because of Gettysburg simply isn't true. They recovered fairly quickly, just as they recovered fairly quickly after Antietam and Second Manassas and Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg and all the other great big battles. The question for the North is really a strategic question. Right now, the Army of the Potomac is based on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, which runs all the way up to the Potomac River at Alexandria, where it starts, and then it runs down to Orange Courthouse and then on to Gordonsville to the south. It's a single track line, and it is at the end of July, the beginning of August of 1863, the Army of the Potomac's main line of communication. In fact, it's its only line of communication. Lee has taken his army into Culpeper County, and Culpeper is really a cockpit of the war in late 1862 and through most of 1863, and it's a very unique piece of territory. It's halfway between Richmond and Washington, and Culpeper County is sort of a piece of topography that sits on its side, and I call it the Culpeper V because the northern and eastern boundary of the county is the upper Rappahannock River, which you see here, which flows down to a point where the Rapidan River, which is more or less flowing from west to south, joins it, and then the combined river go down to Fredericksburg and from there on into Chesapeake Bay. So Culpeper sort of looks like a V laid on its side, and the open mouth here, Robinson's River, which is relatively small, not much an obstacle unless it's flooded, is the boundary between most of Culpeper County and Madison County to the west. And this V opens up toward the foothills that lead you ultimately to the Blue Ridge Mountains. For a Confederate army looking to go onto the offensive, Culpeper is a great jumping off point because from here you can go into the Blue Ridge, go through the passes, get into the Shenandoah Valley, and then of course you can jump from the Shenandoah into Maryland and Pennsylvania. For the North, however, Culpeper is kind of a bugaboo because a Union army advancing down the Orange and Alexandria Railroad and using that railroad line as its axis of advance and its main line of communication is heading away from Richmond. It's going toward no particular point that the Confederates have to defend until you get all the way down to Gordonsville, where you have the connection of the Orange and Alexandria with the Virginia Central, which the Virginia Central is the railroad line that brings the goods of the Shenandoah Valley to the Confederate capital at Richmond. The Federals, of course, are in a quandary here because all of this railroad runs through Confederate territory, and therefore it is subject to raids and harassment by guerrillas and Confederate cavalry who could very easily break the line. And the only way you can keep the line from being broken is to guard its entire length. And Meade has to put about 5,000 men to work guarding this railroad between Rappahannock Station and Alexandria, and that weakens the combat power of his army. And although the Army of the Potomac is bigger than the Army of Northern Virginia, at this point, it is a very narrow advantage, 72,000, 88,000. Not all of those Federals that give Meade a boost are infantry. When you're looking at infantry to infantry force, the odds are much, much closer. And Meade knows that the draft is not yet producing significant numbers of soldiers. It is bringing in the first bounty jumpers and substitutes, many of whom desert before they even get to the army. So qualitatively, what is being sent to reinforce the Army of the Potomac, Meade considers almost worthless. And he looks back and he says, every battle is bloodier and produces more casualties. And if we continue to fight battles where we gain no significant advantage, the North is going to probably run out of the manpower that it needs to conquer the Confederacy. And so he is not in favor of continuing to advance down the Orange and Alexandria, because if he does that, every mile he goes south, he's got to spool more men out to defend that railroad, which means his frontline combat power becomes weaker and weaker. Lee, not having to defend any particular point, can keep backing up until he finds advantageous ground, and then he can turn around and fight a weakened army of the Potomac. Meade predicts that Lee will dig in. The Federals will have to go over to the offensive, and they won't have the necessary advantage in manpower to win a battle. And even if they do win a battle, it will be at great price. And all they will achieve is to push the Confederates a little closer to Richmond into a stronger defensive position with a shorter line of supply that the North would not be able to effectively overcome. Meade would much rather take his army to Fredericksburg and put it on an axis of advance that runs to Akia Landing on the Potomac, so that most of its supply line is by water, very short stretch of railroad that has to be guarded. He would skip having to fight his way over the upper Rappahannock and the Rapidan rivers, and he would be on a direct route to Richmond, which Lee has to defend. This would give Meade more combat power. It would allow him, hopefully, to dictate where a battle would happen. But Lincoln and Halleck and Secretary of War Stanton want nothing to do with sending the Army of the Potomac back to the scene of its greatest disaster. And as they see it, Lee is going to be found in a strong position and be tough to deal with no matter where you fight him. And certainly it will not be harder to fight him and beat him around Culpeper Courthouse than it would be at Fredericksburg. So much to Meade's distress, he's told that he has to stick to the Orange and Alexandria as a line of advance. Now, the Culpeper V has some really interesting topography here that is going to play an important role in what comes to be known as the Bristoe Station campaign. The county is not very wide. If you follow the Orange and Alexandria Railroad from Rappahannock Station down to where it crosses the Rapidan at Rapidan Station, that's only 23 miles. And this is a very beautiful part of Virginia, lots of rolling hills, occasional forests, little creeks, that sort of thing. But there's nowhere inside that Culpeper V that you can really find a position to anchor both flanks of a battle line. Lee, when he retreats back into here in July, spends some time looking at Culpeper, and he finally writes Jeff Davis. He says, "I can find no field of battle in Culpeper County." So what he does at the beginning of August is he takes his infantry below the Rapidan, but he leaves Stuart's cavalry in Culpeper to create a buffer between him and the Army of the Potomac. And so during the 6 weeks when Meade is forced into inaction along the upper Rappahannock, you have the Confederates infantry behind the Rapidan, you have the Confederate cavalry around Culpeper Courthouse, and Meade doesn't really know what the rebels are doing. He's sort of lost visibility on Confederate positions and locations, and the intelligence that he's getting from what used to be known as the Bureau of Military Information and cavalry scouts and that sort of stuff is conflicting information. And if Meade is contemplating an advance into Culpeper, he's got to deal with the fact that the ground north of the upper Rappahannock is higher than the ground inside Culpeper, but so too is the ground south of the Rapidan. That's higher than the ground inside Culpeper. So you can think of Culpeper sort of at the sitting in a bowl with the ground north and south of its two bordering rivers being higher. And what does that mean? All of these fords here are very heavily defended. If the Federals were to try to attack across them, it would probably be a bloodbath and lead to a repulse. And so Culpeper is not a good defensive spot for the Confederates, but if the Federals were in here, it would be a bad defensive spot for them. Culpeper is a place you want to pass through very quickly. It is not a place where you want to leave your army. And nonetheless, to Meade's frustration, he's tied to the O&A by the dictates of Halleck and Stanton and Lincoln. So while the two armies are sitting there and they're recovering from Gettysburg, of course, things are happening in the Western Theater. Rosecrans has advanced on Chattanooga. Burnside has advanced toward Knoxville. As the Confederates find out that both of those places are in danger, they begin to think about what can they do. Lee argues that the best thing we could do is go over to the offensive in Virginia, beat Meade, drive him back on Washington, and force the Federals to pull troops from Tennessee to save their capital. Other Confederates, among them James Longstreet, argue that would make far more sense to send troops from Lee to reinforce Bragg and defeat the Federals in Tennessee and try and turn things around there. Davis sides with Lee, tells him that he can launch an offensive in Virginia in the early part of September. But then those plans go by the wayside when the rebels discover that both Knoxville and Chattanooga have fallen to the Federals. And at that point, Davis says, no offensive in Virginia. We're going to take most of Longstreet's corps. We're going to send it west to help Bragg redeem the situation in Tennessee. And the Confederates make this move fairly promptly. It's an impressive logistical feat for them to move two of Longstreet's division 700 miles over their very rundown railroad network. And Longstreet, of course, has got to get troops there in time to help the Confederates win the Battle of Chickamauga. Do the Federals know what's going on? And the answer is yes, they're beginning to get an idea. There are rumors surfacing, and eventually those rumors become strong enough that Lincoln and Halleck and Stanton tell Meade, you need to find out what Lee is doing if these rumors of the Confederates sending troops off to the west is true. So on September 13th of 1863, under Meade's order, Major General Alfred Pleasonton, commanding the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, launches his entire force into Culpeper County. It leads to 2 days of fighting, very pitched battle around Culpeper Courthouse, and then fighting along the Rapidan fords. And at the end of those 2 days, September 14th, Pleasonton is able to tell Meade, look, Longstreet is gone. We don't know where he went, but he's gone. But the Confederates under Lee's two other corps commanders, Richard Ewell and A.P. Hill, are dug in behind the Rapidan and clearly willing to fight. They're not going to simply back away from the Army of the Potomac. Meade sends this news to Washington, where Halleck is increasingly distracted by events around Chattanooga, and he asks his superiors, well, what do you want me to do? And he doesn't get a response very quickly. So he masses his infantry on the banks of the upper Rappahannock, waits another 24 hours for Halleck to say something. When he doesn't get any word from Halleck, he decides to take his army to Culpeper Courthouse, hoping that this show of Union infantry strength would induce Robert E. Lee to back up closer to Richmond. Of course, it has no effect on Lee whatsoever. Meade sends his cavalry to the river. The Confederate infantry is there. It's not going to go away. And now Meade has put his army into the Culpeper V, and he knows that's a very bad place for his army to be, because the only thing that he can do from there is to attack the Confederates directly across the river, which he knows probably wouldn't work. He could try and outflank them by moving toward Fredericksburg, but he's not allowed to go to Fredericksburg. He could move to the west, but the Army of the Potomac has never operated in Madison County. So at the end of September, he sends his cavalry out there on a reconnaissance in force that leads to the Battle of Jack's Shop. And by the time that Meade is digesting the information that comes back from this reconnaissance, the Battle of Chattanooga, or I'm sorry, the Battle of Chickamauga has been fought, and the Union Army of the Cumberland has been defeated and driven back on Chattanooga. And of course, this creates a crisis that the federal government has to answer. The idea that Edwin Stanton proposes is to take two corps from the Army of the Potomac and replicate what the Confederates had done with Longstreet by sending them out to Tennessee to help redeem the situation at Chattanooga. The other option, the one that is favored by Lincoln and Halleck, is to know now that Lee is weak, we should let Meade try and accomplish something in Virginia. But upon inquiry, it turns out that Meade doesn't have any firm plans. He still doesn't know what he should do. And for the federal high command, that's an unacceptable answer. And so they pull the 11th Corps and the 12th Corps from the Army of the Potomac, put them under Joe Hooker, send them west to help save Chattanooga. And so, interestingly, this movement reduces Meade's strength by about 13,000 men. But it really doesn't matter, because just as these two corps leave, 10,000 men that he'd sent to the north to enforce the draft return to the army. So Meade's actual combat strength is not impacted at all, whereas Lee's gone from a force of 72,000 men after Longstreet's departure to having only 55,000 men. So he basically loses a third of his strength. The Federals essentially lose nothing at all in terms of raw manpower, but psychologically, this matters a great deal because Meade writes his wife and says, well, with the 11th and the 12th Corps gone, I've been put strictly on the defensive now. Lee, of course, doesn't see things that way. He doesn't care that he's lost a third of his strength. He's chomping at the bit to launch an offensive. And now that 2 Union corps are gone, he sees the opportunity. So at the beginning of October, these are the positions. The Confederate infantry is still here below the Rapidan. Federal infantry, the 1st and the 6th Corps, have replaced the Union cavalry north of the river because all that cavalry had been sent on the reconnaissance into Madison County. And Lee can look at a map just like Meade. He knows how vulnerable an army inside the Culpeper V is. And one of the great vulnerabilities here is that the Confederates can mass behind the high ground below the Rapidan. They can shift rapidly to their left, get into Madison County, and then they could swing into Culpeper County from the west because there is no defensive terrain here by which the Federals could block them. And if the Confederates attack from the west, the Federals are in this very narrow stretch of ground. And if they lose a battle, they're forced to retreat over a significant river. And although there are plenty of fords, those fords could disappear if you have one bad day of rain. And there are also, of course, natural bottlenecks that might allow the enemy to catch up to you and maul part of your army before you could escape to the other side of the river. The Confederates also could potentially make an even deeper move and not strike into Culpeper, but go above Culpeper and try and cut the Army of the Potomac off from Washington and sever its O&A line of supply. So this is the situation. The Federals are aware that the Confederates are up to something. They've got signal stations on Pony Mountain and Cedar Mountain and other spots like that. They can see the Confederates moving around, but they just don't know what they're doing. Lee has lots of options, and one of those options, of course, is this offensive. But another option might be to withdraw closer to Richmond, which would not be illogical given the strategic situation. He could back up to, say, the North Anna River, which is eminently defensible, and he would be much closer to Richmond. So Meade knows that Lee's going to do something. He just doesn't know what Lee is going to do. Naturally, no one would be surprised to learn that Lee is intending to go over to the offensive. So on October 8th and October 9th, he begins to shift his army to the west, moving Stuart's cavalry, Hampton's division. The Confederate cavalry has just recently been reorganized into a corps. Wade Hampton is still recovering from his Gettysburg wounds, and so Jeb Stuart's personally in command of his division. Hampton's division under Stuart leading the way, followed by Hill's Corps and Ewell's Corps. Fitz-Lee's cavalry left along the Rapidan with a brigade of infantry from Ewell's Corps, from Johnson's division, to try and fool the Federals into thinking that the Confederates aren't moving. And so on October 9th, Lee begins to outflank Meade. Meade doesn't know that this is happening yet, but he is getting some intelligence that the rebels are doing something here in Madison County. And Meade desperately needs to know exactly what the Confederates are doing. And he's kind of in a pickle because, excuse me, if the Confederates are trying to flank him, he needs to get out of Culpeper County fast because there's no good defensive terrain here. On the other hand, if the rebels are pulling back toward Richmond, he can't allow them to escape unpursued. He had let Lee slip away from him at Falling Waters after Gettysburg. He had let Lee elude him along the Blue Ridge at the end of July. Lee getting away from him here on the Rapidan and falling back toward Richmond would probably be one straw too many on the camel's back for Lincoln and Halleck, and it would probably get Meade fired. But so what does Meade do? Does he shift over to the defensive? Does he prepare for the offensive? And his decision making, of course, is made more difficult because he knows that he's got Lincoln and Halleck and Stanton looking over his shoulder. And that preys on him, that bothers him. And so, what does he decide to do? Well, he decides to try and split the pie in half. So he moves some of his infantry, the Third Corps, over toward the west. He has Kilpatrick's cavalry division here along Robinson's River with Prince's division from the Third Corps in close support. So he's kind of shifting to, guard his right flank here, but at the same time, he's preparing to launch a pursuit of Lee if Lee is pulling back toward the North Anna. So he moves the Fifth Corps down to support the First Corps, which is on the river along with the Sixth Corps, and he orders Buford to take his First Cavalry Division, cross the Rapidan, and move upriver toward Morton's Ford so he could uncover that ford for the Fifth and the First Corps to cross. And if they do that, then they will move toward Raccoon Ford and open the way for the Sixth Corps to cross the river, at which point those three Union Corps would stay there and Buford would go on to Orange Courthouse in pursuit of what would be considered a fleeing Confederate army. So a lot of what Meade is doing here is trying to have it both ways because he doesn't know what Lee is doing, but he also is desperately trying to find information. If Buford can make this movement without running into serious opposition, it probably means that Lee is retreating. If he runs into opposition, then it means that the Confederates are probably going over to the offensive. Unfortunately for Meade, he sends these orders and expects Buford to move that evening, October 9th, to make this reconnaissance, but somehow the orders don't reach Buford until the morning of October 10th. And so he gets a late start, and it's going to be noon before he crosses the river. And by noon, Meade is expecting to be hearing from Buford. What have you found out? And Buford is just now getting over the river. And as he moves upstream, he's going to find hardly any Confederates in front of him. But by the time that he reaches Morton's Ford on the evening of October 10th, the Confederates have already spilled over Robinson's River. Stuart has engaged Kilpatrick's cavalry division in a skirmish around James City that is completely consuming the eyes of the Union horsemen. And that means that Ewell and Hill are advancing through Madison County basically unobserved. Stuart's captured the Federal signal station at Thoroughfare Mountain, so Meade is still blind and sitting here with his headquarters near Culpeper, wondering, where is Buford? What's happened to Buford? Why have we not heard anything from Buford? So there's this terrifying silence on his left, but on his right, there is increasing signs that the Confederates are on the offensive. And Meade wrestles with this until the late afternoon of October 10th. And on the late afternoon of October 10th, he orders his army to begin to pull back toward Culpeper Courthouse. And so the First and the Fifth and the Sixth Corps pull back. The Third Corps it draws Prince in. And when Buford gets to Morton's Ford late on the evening of the 10th, he's looking for the First Corps and it's not there. And he has no idea where it's gone. Now, Pleasanton has sent a courier to him, but that courier has to take the long way around to tell him, hey, the army's going to retreat. You need to get yourself over the river and join that withdrawal. And so after midnight on the 10th, the Union Army begins to pull back across the Rappahannock River, getting out of this treacherous Culpeper V and leaving Buford basically out on a limb. It's going to take the Federals most of the night to get back across the river where Meade is going to organize them for a defense. Buford is not going to get word that this is happening until dawn of October 11th. And at that point, the Confederates under Major Fitz Lee have reacted to his incursion. They've sent a couple of cavalry brigades and the infantry that had been left behind with them to attack the Federals at Morton's Ford. So there's this tough little skirmish here where the Federals have to fight their way back over the river. The Confederates try and get behind them, but Buford's smart enough to have sent troops downstream to block that move. And so the Yankees are able to escape over Morton's Ford, but now the Confederates are in hot pursuit. Kilpatrick, whose cavalry division is the rear guard of the Union Army, has been hovering around Culpeper Courthouse. Stuart comes up on it, sees that Kilpatrick is too strong, so he attempts to outflank him and drive him back. At that same time, Fitz Lee, who's pushed Buford north of the Rapidan River, is pursuing him toward Brandy Station. And you have this very fascinating scene where Kilpatrick's entire division is racing from Culpeper toward Brandy Station. Stuart, with Hampton's division, is trying to outflank Kilpatrick with a rear guard pushing against him from the south, while Fitz Lee's division is moving north in pursuit of Buford. And this is pretty open country. So the people who were there talked about the grand sight of 4 cavalry divisions basically out in the open, moving at full speed across this countryside, banners, flapping in the breeze and the dust being kicked up. And Fitz Lee is not able to stop Buford from getting to Fleetwood Heights, but he is coming up to where he can cut off Kilpatrick. Stuart, hoping to attract Fitz Lee's attention, opens fire on Kilpatrick's, or charges down rather, on Kilpatrick's column. Fitz Lee's horse artillery is shooting at Kilpatrick, and Kilpatrick very soon finds himself cut off. Fitz Lee manages to get a couple of regiments in front of him. Stuart, with Hampton's division, is pushing his rear, and Kilpatrick has to order Custer to take half of his brigade and mass it into a double column of squadrons and break through the 5th and 6th Virginia Cavalry so that the troopers under Kilpatrick can join Buford on Fleetwood Heights. And so this is a highly dramatic scene, but the Federals do manage to cut their way out and get to Fleetwood Heights, at which point you have for the rest of the day, a very bitter cavalry battle, charge, countercharge, a lot of fighting on foot. The Federals manage to hold on. Gradually, they back up to the Rappahannock and manage to cross it. So this chance to destroy 2/3 of the Federal Cavalry Corps comes to nothing for Stuart. But the important thing that he's done is he's kept Buford and Kilpatrick so busy simply fighting for survival that they have lost complete track of where the Confederate infantry is. And the only thing that they can tell Meade is that they had seen rebels wearing knapsacks in the later stages of the fighting around Brandy Station. These, of course, were the infantry regiments that had been left behind to support Fitz Lee, but the Federals don't know that, and so they assume that the Confederate infantry is concentrating around Culpeper Courthouse. And Meade makes his dispositions to defend the upper Rappahannock, not as if he really believes the Confederates would launch a frontal attack across the river, but this will be the base, and he sends Gregg's cavalry division out to guard his right and keep an eye out in case the Confederates should try and outflank him. What Lee does on the night of the 11th is he doesn't quite go into Culpeper with his infantry. He gets close, he pauses there, and decides that having missed his chance to slam into Meade in the vulnerable Culpeper V, he's going to continue to outflank him by moving across the Hazel River toward Amosville, Jeffersonton, with the idea of crossing the upper Rappahannock at Sulphur Springs and Waterloo. General David Gregg's cavalry is out here to watch for that kind of a move. But this is where the Federals have some really bad luck. The Confederates are making this move. It's taking them a while. Gregg sends the first main cavalry to go look for them to make sure they're not making this wide sweep. The main cavalrymen leave too early in the day and they march right across the path of the oncoming Confederates and never see them. A Union cavalry brigade under Irvin Gregg is defending Jeffersonton, and it is hit by Confederate cavalry. It's under orders to observe, not to fight, and it retreats to Sulphur Springs. But then Gregg says, "What are you doing retreating against Confederate cavalry? Go back to Jeffersonton." And so it goes back to Jeffersonton and has no idea that Ewell's entire corps is heading toward it. And at the same time, Fitz Lee is moving up on the Confederate flank. So you can see what the Confederates are doing here. But there is silence from Gregg. He doesn't know any of this is happening. There's been a little sparring with rebel cavalry, but that doesn't mean anything. And so Meade is sitting here on the north bank of the Rappahannock River, wondering, where has Lee's army gone? The only logical thing for Lee's army to be doing is to flanking him to the west. And if he was flanking the AOP to the west, Gregg should be seeing something and saying something, but there's nothing but silence. And does that mean that the Confederates are still waiting around Culpeper Courthouse, wanting the Federals to attack them? Or more worrisome, have the Confederates made this entire movement just to throw Meade back so that they can make a leisurely retreat toward Richmond? In other words, this is a giant ruse, and a lot of Federal commanders think that that's what's going on. Meade waits until noon on October 12th, and finally he decides he can't wait any longer. If the Confederates are around Culpeper Courthouse, he's willing to fight them. So, interestingly, he's okay with going on the offensive in Culpeper, although he wasn't okay with fighting on the defensive in Culpeper. So he decides to send half his army back into Culpeper County. Buford's cavalry division will lead the way, followed by the 6th and the 5th and the 2nd Corps, all under command of John Sedgwick. Sedgwick is supposed to push toward Culpeper. If he finds the Confederates and starts a battle, the rest of the army will come and join him. But as this massive Federal force, 30,000 men, drives toward Culpeper, there's nothing in front of it except Pierce Young's cavalry brigade, which puts up a pretty gallant rear guard action. It tries to make itself look as big as it possibly can, hoping to fool the Federals into thinking that there's a lot of Confederates in front of them. It doesn't fool Buford at all, and he sends word back that there are no Confederates that matter around Culpeper Courthouse, that Lee's army is not there. And so now Meade knows that the A and B is not around Culpeper Courthouse, but he still doesn't know where it's gone. There's still no word from Gregg, and there's no Confederates in front of Sedgwick. So the idea begins to form in the mind of AOP headquarters. The Confederates have tricked us. They're pulling back toward Richmond. Lee's done it to us again. And believing that, and since it's late in the day, Meade allows Buford's column to bivouac in Culpeper. So half of his army is on the south side of the Rappahannock, and the other half is on the north side of the Rappahannock. It's divided by this river, and this is very bad because, of course, we know what's happening. Lee is actually on the offensive, and he's going around the Union flank. The reason that Meade does not learn of this sooner is because in the Battle of Jeffersonton, the Confederate cavalry, backed by Ewell's infantry, overwhelmed the Federal defenders so quickly that they have no time to send word back that the main Confederate army is coming in on Meade's flank from the west. They send a courier racing back with that news, but he's shot and he's captured. And so the Confederates managed to get to the Rappahannock and push their way across against Gregg's cavalry opposition at Sulphur Springs and drive the Federals away. And it's not until 9 o'clock that night that Meade gets word that the rebels are on his flank. They've crossed the Rappahannock. They're moving on Warrenton. They're closer to Washington, D.C. at that point than the Army of the Potomac is. And so at dusk on October 12th, here's your situation. Ewell is at Sulphur Springs. Hill is at Amosville. Stuart's cavalry, Hampton's division, is already in Warrenton. Fitz Lee is between the Federals and Sulphur Springs, and the Army of the Potomac is divided, and it is in danger of the Confederates completely getting its rear and cutting the Federal Army off from Washington, D.C. Once Meade realizes what happened, the ambiguity goes away and he reacts with decisiveness. He tells Sedgwick, get your men back across the river. We've got to pull back toward Manassas and Centreville to avoid the Confederates getting between us and Washington. So a little after midnight, all those federal troops around Culpeper are put on the road and forced to retreat. The federal forces north of the Rappahannock are told to pull back toward Auburn, while the rest of the army is going to go up the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. The Confederates, of course, have lost sight of where most of Meade's infantry is by this point. And Fitz Lee, who's still coming up toward Warrenton, Hill and Ewell still marching on Warrenton, it's going to take them until the morning of the 14th, or the afternoon of the 13th, rather, to get there. Stuart, in the meantime, takes a couple of cavalry brigades and moves down toward the Orange and Alexandria Railroad on a reconnaissance to try and find where Meade is. So Meade knows that Lee's somewhere off to his west. Lee knows that Meade is somewhere off to his east, but neither of them have great specificity on exactly where the other guy's infantry formations are. So the Federals are retreating north of the Rappahannock. This is a drawing by Edward Forbes showing that retreat. This is the railroad bridge at Rappahannock Station that the Federals had just rebuilt in early August, and they're also using a ford here. It takes most of the night for the Federals to get north of the river. After they get their last man across, they burn the railroad bridge, a drawing here by Alfred Woad. So the bridge that they had built in early August, now they destroy in the middle of October. So the Federal retreat is a dramatic thing. It's a forced march, very hard on the Union troops. Now everything begins to focus around the little village of Auburn, which is east of Warrenton and northeast of Catlett, as northwest rather, Catlett Station on the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And the reason that Auburn matters, of course, is this is a road junction. 5 important roads intersect at Auburn, and among them is the Carolina Road, which is the road that the right wing of Meade's army is using to retreat toward Manassas and Centreville. So we're going to have a convergence on the evening of October 13th on Auburn. The Federal 3rd and 2nd Corps, supported by Gregg and Kilpatrick's division, are moving up the Carolina Road toward Auburn. The rest of the Confederate Army is concentrating around Warrenton, where Lee is going to have to pause for a day to resupply it. It's almost out of food. This part of Virginia is completely ravaged. There's no food to be had. You can't live off the land. So his supply wagons, which had gone, of course, on a more westerly route and are moving very slowly, are going to not reach Warrenton until late in the day on the 13th. So the advantage that Lee has gained by outflanking Meade and Meade not knowing it is basically thrown away necessarily, because he has to pause his infantry around Warrenton in order to feed them and resupply them. Stuart, by the way, remember his reconnaissance, he's gone to Auburn. And he's gone up to a tall hill at Auburn, and he can see to the south, and he can see these federal troops moving. But when he sees them, it looks like they're going to turn toward the Orange and Alexandria. And so, seeing that, Stuart decides to find out what's going on along the railroad. And so he drives down with 2 brigades toward the railroad. He gets to St. Stephen Church, where he's got a good vantage point, and he can see the Union Army, or a good part of it, along the railroad. And more enticingly, he sees the main supply train of the Union Army, some 1,300 wagons waiting there right for the taking. They're white-topped canvas beds make it look like a 300-acre field of snow. And Stuart is sorely tempted to go after these wagons, but he knows that, he could frighten the Federals, he could discombobulate them, but there's a chance for something much more meaningful here. And so he sends a courier back toward Warrenton to tell Lee, here's where the Federals are. If you can make a night march, we could attack them in the morning and probably do them great damage. This courier, though, gets to Auburn and he finds out that the troops that had been left behind to hold Auburn have been driven away by the Federal Third Corps and Kilpatrick's cavalry, which is advancing up from the west. And so Stuart is now cut off. And his aide sends word back to Stuart, there are Federals behind you. The Confederates are going to send multiple couriers to get to Warrenton and tell Lee what's going on. Stuart, when he learns that, immediately turns around, rides back toward Auburn, and finds the Federal Third Corps passing through the place. And so he is completely cut off between the two wings of the Army of the Potomac, and he's forced to hide his two brigades and the 7 artillery pieces with him in some nearby woods in a little valley, and wait till dawn when he hopes that Lee, having received one of his couriers, will act on Stuart's suggestion to have the Confederate infantry attack the Federals from the west in the morning, when Stuart will attack them from the east, and they'll catch them in a vice and hopefully destroy some significant part of the Army of the Potomac. Now, what's happening here is that the Third Corps and Kilpatrick are going to march through Auburn and keep going north. The Second Corps under Gouverneur Warren and Gregg's cavalry division, however, are going to halt short of Auburn and go into camp for the night. And during the evening, they're going to get new orders that when they get to Auburn, rather than follow the Third Corps north, they're supposed to turn east and rejoin the main army along the Orange and Alexandria. Lee, well after midnight, gets word from Stuart about what's happened and Stuart's plea for assistance. And now Lee has to make a decision. Does he abandon his effort to get between between Meade and Washington, or does he go to Stuart's rescue? And Lee decides that he's going to try and do both. So he's going to send Ewell north. He's going to send, he's going to send Hill north, and he's going to send Ewell to rescue Stuart. So this sets up a very confusing fight around Auburn on the morning of August 4th. So you can see most of the Army of the Potomac now is on the Orange and Alexandria, preparing to move north through Bristoe Station and Manassas towards Centreville. Kilpatrick and French with the Third Corps have moved well past Auburn. They're supposed to be heading in the same direction. But the Second Corps and Gregg's cavalry are in potentially a very dangerous spot. The armies begin to move on the morning of the 14th. We see the Federals are all retreating towards Centreville. Hill is trying to move through New Baltimore and Greenwich, hoping to cut the Federals off before they can make that retreat. Ewell is going along with Fitz Lee to rescue Jeb Stuart. And that comes as a rude shock to the Federals under Warren, who don't know that Stuart's over here. They don't know that Ewell is coming in from the flank. The Confederate cavalry under Lomax is probing forward that morning. It runs into Gregg's cavalry. A skirmish breaks out. Neither side really knows much about this terrain. It's very foggy. It's hard to see. The shooting that breaks out over here was really just a skirmish, but Stuart, hearing it, believes that this is Lee launching the attack from the west that he had proposed. And so he trots out his horse artillery, which opens fire on Brigadier General Caldwell's division, which has climbed up onto the tall hill above Auburn and has stacked arms and is making coffee. This is what that hill looks like. And suddenly the Federal coffee makers are subjected to a lethal bombardment by the Confederate horse artillery. They have to retreat to the other side of the hill to get out from under it. The Federals will forever after call this Coffee Hill. because their brewing had been disrupted that morning. Federal artillery turns around, takes the Confederates under Stuart under fire. And at this point, Stuart realizes, oh my gosh, the Federals are turning toward me, and the firing coming from the west has stopped. And so I jumped the gun, and now I've got to get out of here. And since Federal infantry has turned east at Auburn and is coming toward him, he has no choice but to retreat to the east, hope he can find a way back over the little creek here, Cedar Run, and escape. But to buy time, he sends the 1st North Carolina Cavalry in sort of a forlorn charge against the Union infantry. That cavalry, under the command of Colonel Thomas Ruffin, makes a very gallant charge. It's shot to pieces. Ruffin is mortally wounded, but it does knock the Federals back on their heels long enough to allow Stuart to get away. He's going to be able to escape across Cedar Run and evade the trap that he thought he was in. At this point, Warren is now aware that he is in great danger. He's deploying his troops to protect the crossing at Auburn. Ewell's coming up, but he's as confused by the situation as Warren is. And as he begins to deploy his infantry, he realizes that this is really difficult terrain. The Federals have the high ground. This would be very hard nut to crack. And so he decides that he's going to outflank it. So he sends Early and some artillery across Cedar Run to hit the Federals from the north, while Rhodes and some artillery shifts to the south, and Johnson comes up to take the center. All of this takes a lot of time. The Federals are steadily retreating to the east as it happens. And as a consequence of that, although there's some very scary moments for Warren, he gets away. By the time the jaws of the Confederate trap close, only a few regiments from Colonel Brooks' brigade are there to be trapped, and the Confederates take some prisoners, but the Federals do manage to get away. So it's been a very chaotic morning, a very scary morning for Warren, but he has managed to elude the trap and delay Ewell because he has had to try and save Stuart, who at the end of the day really didn't need saving. And Ewell is not marching north like Hill is marching north. So after this fight around Auburn, Warren and Gregg's cavalry are going to get to the Orange and Alexandria and begin to follow the 5th Corps north towards Centreville. The main Union wagon train, under the protection of John Buford, is taking a more easterly route. Hill has already gone up to the north and has moved through Greenwich toward Bristoe Station in hopes of cutting off the Federals. Ewell belatedly is following him. Stuart was supposed to move on Ewell's flank and be a buffer and do reconnaissance, but Stuart, who hasn't slept the whole night, is confused by a sharpshooter battalion that's following the Federals here. And so Stuart is going to poke the Federal rear guard instead of being up here to help, protect Hill and Ewell as they go through. The consequences of all this lead us to a place called Bristoe Station, where there is a railroad cut that crosses a plain here. This is going to be very important. There is Broad Run, which the railroad crosses. The Federals are moving up this railroad, and then they're going to go from there towards Centreville. The 5th Corps has already crossed up here at a ford around Milford and is waiting for the 2nd Corps under Warren to come up. General Sykes is very, very nervous. He's afraid that the Confederates are going to get in the gap between him and the 3rd Corps, which is ahead of him. And so he's sending word constantly to Warren, where are you? Will you hurry up? And when he sees one of Warren's patrols show up, he jumps the gun. He says, oh, there he is. And he begins to leave, which is always going to embitter the 2nd Corps, one of whose officers quips, Sykes was told that the 2nd Corps was coming, and so it was, and so was Christmas. So Sykes begins to pull out before Warren is within range of his support, and at the same time, the leading elements of A.P. Hill's Corps, Harry Heth's division, are coming down toward Bristoe Station. Hill's ridden out in front, he gets to some high ground and he looks across this vast plain north of Bristoe Station, and he sees a multitude of Union stragglers. And he also sees the Fifth Corps beginning to march away. And he believes the Fifth Corps is the Union rear guard. He doesn't know that Stuart's over that Warren is over here because Stuart isn't there to tell him. And so Hill believes that the Federals are about to escape, that the whole point of the campaign to hit the Army of the Potomac on the move and destroy some portion of it before it can get away is about to be lost. So he hurries his troops into position. Heth's division in the lead. He deploys its three biggest brigades for the purpose of moving across Broad Run and trying to engage the Fifth Corps before it escapes. The Confederate artillery comes up. It opens fire on all these Union stragglers and panics them. And then that done, Hill tells Heth to begin to move forward. But as Heth begins to move forward, the Second Corps is coming up on a road parallel to this railroad cut where it can't be seen. Union skirmishers are advancing to the west. They begin to engage the Confederates. And as the rebels under Cooke and Kirkland move toward Broad Run across this plain, the Federal skirmishers become such a harassing force that Cooke decides that he's got to deal with them. He's worried that there's something over here that he doesn't see. And he sends word to Hill. He says, there's something over there. This is dangerous. We should not be making this advance just yet. And Hill agrees, and he has everything stopped for 10 critical minutes, waiting long enough for Anderson's division to begin to appear on the battlefield. And then he tells Heth to go ahead. And those 10 minutes are critical because they allow the Union Second Corps to get behind this railroad cut. If the Confederates had moved in those 10 minutes, it might have been them taking position along this railroad cut. But those 10 minutes give Warren the time he needs. He's familiar with this terrain because as the Army's chief engineer, he'd been had responsibility for making sure the O&A ran smoothly. So he's beginning to put his troops behind this railroad embankment, his artillery on the high ground just to the east of it. And as the Confederates are advancing, they begin to take fire. And so they turn toward the railroad cut, not under Heth's orders, not under Hill's orders. Cooke is responding to flanking fire and he turns. And so Kirkland turns with him. Walker's brigade doesn't turn. It keeps going in the direction that it was told to go. The Federal skirmishers pull back. The Union infantry is now going into line behind the railroad embankment. And now the Confederates are starting to take fire from the main Union line. Cooke goes down with a wound. His replacement has to decide what to do. And he says, well, we can't stay where we are, so I guess we better charge. And so Cooke's brigade advances on the railroad cut. Kirkland's does the same. Hill sends artillery, McIntosh's battalion, onto a little hill here to support them. But of course, the Confederates are advancing toward a trap. It was not a cleverly laid trap. It's a happenstance trap. The Federals barely managed to get there in front of the Confederates. This is not some pre-planned thing. This is not something Heth ordered. It's not something Hill ordered. This is a response to the sudden presence of Yankees on the Confederate flank. And it's sort of a halting advance. This is not some Pickett's charge thing sweeping across this plain. And as the Confederate regiments get closer to the railroad cut, they begin to take fire from the Union artillery, the Union infantry. The 27th North Carolina gets right up to the cut, as does the 52nd and the 11th. The Confederates actually manage to get around the Union flank very briefly. And here, where the road passes through the railroad cut, they actually manage to temporarily break the Union line. But ultimately, the firepower that the Union has here, 3 batteries of artillery and part of a 4th, and all that infantry firing from the protection of this railroad cut, it's simply too much. And the Confederate units are forced to retreat. Most of them make a fairly orderly retreat. A few are routed from the field. But they're driven back to their starting point, at which juncture the Federals sally forth and manage to take several guns from McIntosh's battalion, which had been abandoned by its artillerymen because of the intense Union fire. As the Confederates under Heth retreat, Anderson's division and Early's division show up on the field. So does the rest of the Second Corps, along with Gregg's cavalry protecting its wagon train and Buford cavalry protecting the Army's main train. The Confederates are trying to get into a position as the light is fading so that they could strike the flank of the Union position. There really wasn't much chance of doing that. There was too little daylight left. But Gordon, which is Early's biggest brigade, sees Gregg and all those wagons and can't resist, and he goes chasing after them, which really discombobulates all of Early's plans. So whatever chance there was for the Confederates to try and attack this Union position before nightfall, it goes belly up. With Gordon slipping the leash, and just as well because the Federal position here now is incredibly strong. It's got all of this artillery, the horse artillery, and the Confederates couldn't have taken it. So during the night, the Confederates try and position themselves to launch an attack in the morning. The Federals, of course, know that they are isolated all alone. And so they can't stay. They slip away during the night and manage to evade the Confederates. They get away without the Confederates knowing what's happening at all. And so the Federals are gone the next morning when the Confederates advance on their position. And at that point, Lee says, well, we've done what we can do. I would love to drive the Federals further north, but really all I would do is push them into the defenses of Washington, where I can't get at them. I'd love to stay close to the Potomac, but my army is not equipped for winter this far north, and Richmond can't feed me that far north. And so he keeps his army at Bristoe Station on October 15th. He sends Stuart to Bull Run to harass the Federals and sort of keep them guessing. But while Stuart is keeping the Yankees busy, Lee is going to order his army to retreat back toward Culpeper County. The Federals are going to be slow to pursue because it starts to rain. And on October 15th, 16th, and 17th, Bull Run is flooded. Meade cannot cross it until October 18th, and that is the same day that Lee gets all of his infantry across the upper Rappahannock back into Culpeper County. The Federal pursuit is going to lead to the last fight of the campaign, the Battle of Buckland Mills. Kilpatrick's division pushing down the Warrenton Turnpike runs into Stuart with Hampton's division around Buckland Mills, and there's something of a standoff here. But Fitz Lee and Stuart are in communication by signal flag. And Fitz Lee, who's retreating down the Orange and Alexandria, suggests a stratagem to Stuart. If he will feign a retreat in front of Kilpatrick, Fitz Lee will turn north and come in and get behind the pursuing Federals, and they will trap them. And when Fitz Lee attacks, Stuart will turn around and attack as well, and they'll surround and destroy Kilpatrick's division. And so that's the plan. This is a drawing by Woad of the firing around Buckland. There's Buckland. The Confederate artillery is over here. But Stuart agrees. So he begins this retreat. Fitz Lee turns north, moving through Greenwich against Buckland. And this would have worked perfectly, except that Custer insists on stopping his troops who've been doing most of the fighting and having breakfast, a late breakfast, before they pursue Stuart alongside Davies' brigade. And so when Fitz Lee comes up toward Buckland, he expects to find nothing, but in fact, he runs into Custer's brigade. And that starts a fight. And when that fight breaks out, Stuart hears the signal that Fitz Lee is in the Federal rear, and he turns around and he attacks Davies in the front. And so essentially, here's what you get. Fitz Lee attacking Custer at Buckland, Stuart with Hampton's division turning around and assaulting Davies, who's begun to retreat back toward Buckland. And by the time that the Davies is getting close to Buckland, Fitz Lee has gotten between Davies and Custer. Custer is able to retreat along the Warrenton Turnpike, but Davies is forced to retreat across country all the way back to Haymarket and the protection of Union infantry, a distance of 3 miles across country with the Confederates in hot pursuit. It's almost a rout. And the Confederates, who, of course, are delighted with the victory, call this the Buckland Races. And it's a very humiliating moment for the Union Third Corps, and really the moment that George Custer loses faith in Justin Kilpatrick as a commander. The Confederates, of course, have won a little victory here, but that victory has far-reaching consequences because Kilpatrick, in explaining his defeat,
Jeff,
tells me,
Jeff,
yes,
do me a favor. Can you combine this where we are right now? There's so much to absorb, and I know I'm rude, but there's so much to absorb. Could you give it this in the next lecture and then in April 27th? There is a
well,
lot in here. There,
this has got about 30 seconds left to go, Rich.
okay.
So,
We timed it right.
okay.
No,
So
go ahead.
Kilpatrick tells Meade that the reason he was beaten was there was Confederate infantry in the Battle at Buckland. And so Meade, thinking he's found the Army of Northern Virginia, shifts his entire army up to Buckland, preparing to attack Lee's main force. And so the Confederates, who are now behind the Rappahannock, are nowhere near, and Meade gets ready to land this powerful blow. And when he marches his infantry forward, the Confederates aren't there, and Lee has given Meade the slip once again. And as he retreats, he destroys the Orange and Alexandria Railroad behind him so that the Federals cannot pursue him until they rebuild the railroad, which might mean they can't do anything else in 1863. And by the time that we get to the end of the month, the two armies are back to exactly the same spot they had been in July at the end of the Gettysburg campaign.
Wow.
So if you think that nothing much happens during this period of the war, a lot happens during this period of the war.
I got to tell you something. This tonight was so comprehensive, and I'll tell everybody else, this program is going to be on YouTube. So we'll be able to watch it again because there is so much to absorb in this lecture, and it's just amazing. This is just the standard lecture. This is a phenomenal lecture. But there's so much to absorb on here. I got to ask you, you're coming back next month. Could you continue on through April too? No, I'm dead
Well,
serious.
yeah. Once I get through Rappahannock Station, I am not done with Mine Run yet, which is of course the next thing. So I really kind of need to hold off until I finish that up, and can tell that story with all the maps and everything, because those aren't made yet. So I
Okay.
appreciate the offer, but I'll
No,
have to
it's so
decline.
comprehensive. I could have gotten 3 lectures out of tonight. No, really, seriously, there's so many facets of it. You never realize the sequence of it until you start studying. I know I realize I'm rude here, but darn this, you just it's hard to absorb, and I'm at that stage. We'll take some questions now, guys. Let me see what the chat line says on here. First one. Let's see, it says on a broader scale, did your research either uncover or pick up whether or not the outcome of Chickamauga or Chattanooga in the short term or long term influenced what happened in the Virginia campaign?
Well, obviously it influences it because, that leads Longstreet to go west, and it leads the Union 11th and 12th Corps to go west. But here's the thing. Lee was very doubtful that transfer would accomplish anything. And even Longstreet had some doubt. And although Chickamauga was a great Confederate victory, the Confederates failed to follow it up. It ultimately is the worst thing that could have happened to the Confederacy, because the debacle at Chickamauga leads to the replacement of Rosecrans by George Thomas. And more importantly, it leads Lincoln to call Grant, who was just kind of cooling his heels after Vicksburg and recovering from that bad carriage accident. it brings Grant to Chattanooga, and Grant redeems the situation at Chattanooga. And because of that success, the federal government decides to make him general in chief. There was no talk about making Grant general in chief before Chattanooga. Halleck's plans for Grant was to either send him against Mobile or send him into the Trans-Mississippi. He actually writes Meade that the reason that the Confederates would be so aggressive against you in Virginia is they know that if Banks and Grant can clear out the rebels in the Trans-Mississippi, their cause is lost. So the transfer of Longstreet to Chattanooga backfires on the Confederates in the worst possible way. There was no reason to know that. You could have hoped that there would have been a different outcome. It was certainly a reasonable thing for the Confederates to attempt, but without Longstreet at Chickamauga, there's no Confederate victory. And without a Confederate victory at Chickamauga, there's no siege of Chattanooga that leads to the elevation of Grant as general in chief, and then Sherman in command in the West and Grant overseeing Meade in the East. And so if Lee keeps Longstreet, the Bristoe Station campaign probably leads to a big battle. It's probably a battle that the Confederates win. It's another, hollow victory in Virginia. It certainly would even the score for Gettysburg. It might have cost Meade his command, but the stalemate in Virginia would have been maintained regardless. But if you do not have the Confederate victory at Chickamauga and then the events at Chattanooga, Grant is sent to Mobile or he's sent to the Trans-Mississippi. Rosecrans remains in command of the Army of the Cumberland, and he's the Union general that's going to push on Atlanta in 1864. And Meade is probably still in command of the Army of the Potomac without Grant there to ride herd on him. And so 1864 is Meade against Lee in Virginia and Rosecrans against either Bragg or Joe Johnston in Georgia. And who knows how all that turns out, but I think we can all agree the war would have been very different. So this one of the things that I have concluded through this study is that the Confederates would have probably been smarter to keep a maximum force under Robert E. Lee than to send Longstreet west the way that it worked out.
Okay, let me just take just a comment. These maps are awesome. Thank you. I'll second that. How did you? Well, okay, let me just go through all the questions on the maps. You said the maps are great. I'm amazed by the level of detail. Um, okay, somebody says agrees with me that there's so much on here. I agree. The maps are first rate. Wish they were in color. So complicated. Okay, that's it.
They are in color.
No, I guess he says in the book. Is there a book in the book? They're not
Oh,
called.
yes. So they're of course in black and white in the book. But one of the things I want to do once I get mine run finished is to put out a volume, Meade and Lee after Gettysburg Illustrated, that would be a larger format and have kind of a magazine article level of text, but all the color maps and a lot of the pictures that I wasn't able to fit into the books and bigger pictures and that kind of thing. My wife does my maps for me, by the way. She's a professional graphic designer,
Wow.
and so I'm very fortunate in that regard.
No, this I'll tell you something. Having other lectures with programs, these maps were just superb, and it just looks so easy to follow here. Which somebody said, superb presentation, excellent job, wonderful lecture, excellent job. Thank you very. When's the next presentation? That can answer that. That's next month. Outstanding. Thank you. Wow, you're right. A lot of activity in the same time frame. Nice show.
What day
Maps were
next month?
great. Battle to understand the battles. Great lecture. Wow. Great. That's what I kept saying. Great. And everybody agreed with me. That's why I feel so guilty about jumping in here. There's so much to absorb in there. That's what I'm trying to say. Hell,
You can understand why we broke that second book into two lectures.
oh
So,
yeah,
yeah.
I'm dead serious. You can get 4 lectures out of here. There is so much to absorb, seriously, and that's a compliment, the highest order here. When you say you want somebody back, and now you want somebody back to do another one after he does the other one, so there's nothing is it's burnt out. Somebody loves your library. What day next month? Well, the fourth Thursday of the month. That's when we meet. whatever that fourth Thursday, just count the
I see the
calendar.
question here about how long it took to get the O&A back into operation. The Federals have it back in operation almost all the way to Rappahannock Station by the beginning of November. So just a couple of weeks. And that's despite the fact that the Confederates utterly destroyed it. They chopped down all the telegraph poles, they burned all the ties, they destroyed all the bridges, and thus is the Union's industrial capacity that all that damage was repaired in a little less than 3 weeks.
There's something that says your wife is an outstanding cartographer, and thanks
Yes,
so much
she
for.
is.
Two
Well,
things
we have the advantage of some really good period maps that were drawn by especially the Army of the Potomac of this part of Virginia. And that makes a huge difference, trust me.
Oh, somebody asked how many.
Rich, the fourth Thursday should be March 27th.
Okay. By the way, the people who are watching tonight, Abigail's given us, we have the same link for next month. I will send you a notice, and the notice will say yes for the link. And it's nice to know how many people will be attending, but it's going to be the same link. So save the link I sent you tonight. So in case there's some sort of a mix-up, which invariably happens, somebody says I didn't receive it, and somehow it gets lost. So just save this link. And if anybody has any questions, I see names I don't know from before. Our email address is NJ, acronym for New Jersey, spelled out Civil War, and then RT, the acronym for Roundtable, at AOL.com. Guys, I want to thank you all for attending. This was just a great lecture, and I will watch it now on YouTube because, and hopefully there won't be a test. Hopefully. But thank you so much. Guys, we'll say
My
good night.
pleasure.
We'll say good night now.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night,
Okay.
everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night, everybody. I'm going to end the meeting now. So
Right.
bye-bye and thank you
Bye.
for coming.